This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
What he found in his questioning was that a lot of people thought that they knew deep truths, but what they really had were opinions, and their opinions weren't steeped in any type of truth. And the more he questioned them, the more frustrated they would get, because he would expose the fact that really the only thing they carried were opinions.
Hello, and welcome to America Daily. I'm Jessica Beatty. Today's guest is Eric Bess. He's a writer, a fine artist, and a PhD candidate in aesthetic philosophy. Today we'll be discussing dialectics, or the art of refutation and understanding the opposite according to Socrates, and how he used it to arrive at a truer understanding of life. We'll follow up with how Hegel and Karl Marx understood dialectics, and how it led to their ethos of struggle. Here's America Daily contributor Timothy Gebhardt and his conversation with Eric Bess.
Here we are with Eric Bess to talk about the power of critical thinking. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about dialectics in regards to critical thinking. And in philosophy, there are different types of dialectics, but it generally refers to when two opposing elements come together or clash in order to reveal a new truth or an overlying truth. And so there's a certain dialectic, it's called dialectical monism, that kind of begins with Heraclitus, who's a pre-Socratic philosopher. And he suggests that, for instance, day and night are dialectical in that they are opposite of one another, but their truth cannot exist without that opposite. And there's an overlying truth, the sun, which gives birth to both of these truths. Without the sun, you can't have day and night. You, I guess, would essentially just have night. But since there's this overlying truth, you have these opposites that sort of give birth to one another. So this thing, dialectics, is what, in a way, is the basis of critical thinking, at least when we move into Socrates in philosophical history.
Okay, so basically this is looking at the other side. Do you think this is a prerequisite for critical thinking, just looking at two opposing sides of the argument? Is that what Socrates and dialectical thinking is trying to do?
Yes. But Socrates is also, he is presuming a truth, an absolute truth. In Plato's words, Plato calls it the one, for instance, this one truth that just sort of encompasses everything. And so when Socrates says things like justice or love, he's in a way referring to the same thing. And his goal is to try to find out what this truth is. And so he uses opposing elements to try to uncover this truth. He's actually a really interesting character. He would supposedly walk around Athens and he wouldn't shower. He'd wear the same clothes all the time. There were even sightings of him just sort of standing for like hours, staring off into the distance. But he was loved because he would get into these discussions with people. And he would get into these discussions, legend has it, because he was told by the oracle that he was the smartest man or the wisest man in Athens. And he thought that this was just crazy. He thought that there's no way he could be the wisest person because he simply knew that he wasn't wise. So he went off to find someone who was wiser. He thought that he would find experts in fields like politics, for instance, or art or music or whatever, and question these people about their craft. Because he thought that if you could be, again, thinking about things in terms of some absolute truth or overlying truth, if you were an expert in something like music, you could also be an expert in something like virtue. because the principles of one were the same as the principles of the other if you were wise in it.
Okay. Just a quick question. How much of this is based on rationality versus revelation? I don't know if they could be the same thing in this case, but so what was Socrates using to try to figure out what the like one standard was?
Yes, so that's actually a really great question. Socrates claimed to have his own personal god that was called a demon or a daimon, but he said that this thing that was with him all of the time never told him what to do, but always told him what not to do. But this is why he was ultimately condemned for corrupting youth and for not following the traditional gods of Athens. And he was put to death by poison. So you could say that some of this is from Revelation. However, he also claims that even though some would say that this is maybe Plato talking through Socrates in some of the later writings, that rationality and reason are the most important thing in his philosophy. That you have to reason through what the one is or reason to what the one is. And you can do that by way of dialectics. So you can know what something is, like virtue, by trying to find out what it isn't. You can find out what it isn't, and maybe you can get closer to what it is, which would be a rational movement and a dialectical one.
When we get into rationality, though, at least in scientific rationalism, there's been a lot of problems there. So I don't know if they're the same thing as the rationalism that Socrates is trying to find, but in scientific rationalism, you have these problems. Like, for example, Earth is overpopulated with human beings. So maybe a solution would be just to machine gun people left and right, and that would solve the problem. That, it's a solution, but obviously there's problems with that solution because
Yes.
it negates so many things. So where do you think Socrates was understanding rationality?
I think for Socrates, the most important thing was ethics or virtue. So he's attempting to find out what this is by way of rationality. The problem, though, and this is at least what later philosophers, modern philosophers bring up, like Nietzsche is one of them. He says that a lot of the problems that come about, especially in science, come about because the Socratic rationalism in its maturity produces things like what you just said, where it's just mathematical, it's just about calculation and measurement, and it's no longer about how I may feel in regards to another human being, which also could have its problems.
Okay, so Socrates then, again, just to reiterate, he was searching for virtue, right? He said that was the one thing. Like, so is this a quest for what is good? Because I know in ancient Greek society, they tried to conform to like the perfect model of a human being. Is that kind of what Socrates is doing here?
Yes, yes. Socrates is in search of what it means to be good. He actually even says that he's attempting to save people's souls. He wants people to have good, clean souls, and he wants their souls to strive for perfection. And he claims that emotion, for instance, can get in the way of that perfection. So anything irrational can prevent one from cleansing their soul. And this is why Plato in the Republic sort of says that there should be philosopher kings. If you're going to have someone ruling your perfect society, it should be someone who has complete control of their emotions. They're measured and they're able to make decisions rationally. Then you'll have a good society, one that thinks about at least the highest amount of happiness for all of its citizens can be rationally sort of measured out.
So with Socrates, when he was going around asking people all these questions, what is it in a sense he was trying to have people come to their own conclusions, instead of having these fixed notions, right? about how we go through our lives?
That's a really good question. I think that he was interested in being taught what truths were more than anything else. But what he found in his questioning was that a lot of people thought that they knew deep truths, but what they really had were opinions, and their opinions weren't steeped in any type of truth at all. And the more he questioned them, the more frustrated they would get because he would expose the fact that really the only thing they carried were opinions, which is why during his trial, I think it was maybe 30 members. If 30 people would have voted the other way, he would have lived out of like 500 in their Senate. And so those extra 30 voted majority rules, and he was put to death for corrupting the youth because of his questioning.
It wasn't so much as this rational thinking they were using to try to come to a conclusion that, okay, this old guy here, he's just rambling on about things. He's not really corrupting people. We can just let him be and do his thing. They were kind of getting into these, kind of mob mentality. And, at that point, like the group mentality has a different mentality than the individual because the group mentality tends to not use that critical thinking, right?
Yes, I would definitely say so. But yeah, all of that seems to be accurate. There were a lot of politicians who, especially since he was again questioning what is it to be a politician, he would just ask politicians stuff like this. You're an expert as a politician. You're a politician. Maybe you can tell me what it means to be good, or maybe you can tell me what it means to run a good society. Because if you can tell me that, then maybe you can find out what justice or virtue are. But what he would find when questioning these politicians is that they didn't know how to be politicians. A lot of them were just interested in being famous or being rich or being powerful. So, and he would expose that. A lot of politicians condemned him to death for that reason alone. Very
Yeah.
telling of the human struggle with morality for a very long time.
So, from my understanding, it seems that Socrates was trying to get at the root of the human condition and figure out why people do and think the things they do. So he would ask, all these random Athenians these questions to get them to maybe see for themselves a glimpse into their notions or ways of thinking that they have just running in the background, in their lives that maybe they're just never aware of.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think it's just Socrates, like there's a quote by him, it's the unexamined life isn't worth living. That we should really examine the whys of our actions. Why are we doing this? Why do we believe this? How deep is our understanding of the positions we hold? Or are we just following things because everyone else around us are following them? Which can be a very powerful thing when everyone around you believes something and they believe it passionately. It can be very difficult to contradict them. So, what is it to be authentic? And how deeply do we have to examine ourselves to get close to that authenticity?
Yeah, and this poses another question because in some instance you have to go, oh, well, maybe Socrates has some insight into this, but you have to kind of step outside of yourself because you can't understand yourself when you're kind of within a certain mindset, right? So you kind of have to step outside of that. And as you were saying, he was staring out into space for hours on end. What's he doing? Is there like how would he do that? Or is that necessary?
I think it's definitely necessary. And I think he's doing it in his willingness to be taught. At least that's what the whole premise of this story is that he's trying to go off and find someone who's wise because he believes that there is a wiser person than him in Athens because he's the least wise. And the wise person can tell him or teach him what virtue is, which to him is the most important thing. So the openness to be taught and the belief that I don't have all of the answers is, I think, critical in this story. That I can go to someone and ask them what they think about something, question them without forcing my own ideology on them and have an exchange, a communication, a sharing of myself with another person and them sharing themselves with me. And maybe, which this in itself is a dialectic, even though some would call it a dialogue. But in this, maybe we'll find some kind of truth that is beyond both of us. Maybe we'll both be adjusted just a little bit and find that we're both maybe okay in some areas, maybe not okay in others, and rise above what we previously were. Can't do that when you yell and shout at people, though.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different people throughout history that have, kind of looked at dialectics differently. You have Marx and Hegel, and they seem to kind of have maybe an opposite view of this, coming to that perfection of society.
Yes. So I think this is really interesting because if we consider Socrates and then we consider Marx, I feel like that in itself is a dialectic. You just have two opposing understandings of what the ideal society is, maybe even how it's brought about. One's focusing on the mind, asking questions, critical thinking, and the other one is focusing on material. So Hegel specifically is thinking about a historical dialectic, and his dialectic is predicated on the idea that throughout history, there have been opposing forces in experience that sort of contrast with one another, resolve what contrasts, and moves history forward. He has a famous story, philosophical tale, however you want to describe it, what he calls the master slave dialectic. And he says this is how we as subjects, as human beings, come to our subjectivity. So you and I, for instance, I wake up one day, he's of course talking about the beginning of time, but I wake up one day and I recognize that I'm a subject in the fact that I can refer to myself as a person. And I see you, and you just woken up and you can refer to yourself as a subject. Recognize yourself as an individual person. We look at each other, we recognize each other, but I want you also to recognize me as a subject. In order to do that, I need you to relinquish your own subjectivity. So Hegel says that this leads to a fight, in that we both fight each other to the death because my subjectivity is my life. And if I can't get you to grant me my own subjectivity, then what's the point of living? Of course, so this isn't always the case. And sometimes people just submit. And when someone submits, there's the master and there's the slave. The master makes the slave do a bunch of things. The master orders the slave about to go do this, go get that, et cetera, et cetera. The slave is working with nature and is producing things and is coming to its own subjectivity through the transformation of nature. Whereas the master is not. The master only has the recognition of a subject who's actually not even a subject anymore. So what ends up happening is the slave gains enough confidence in itself and gains enough experience through nature to overthrow the master. And Hegel says that this happens multiple times in history. For Hegel, though, the point is that at some point, this contradiction will resolve itself and the dialectic will end. Instead, what you'll have is a community. Instead of individuals competing for recognition, they'll have recognition inside of themselves because they will have become one with God. It's kind of the point that Hegel was trying to get at least from my understanding of him. And Marx takes this, he removes the religion from it. So he removes God from it. And he looks at the dialectic of just property. So material ownership of things instead of the subjectivity of, or how I look at myself. And in doing that, he says that the perfect society can come about when, just like in Hegel, you have a community in which there are no longer individuals competing with one another, and instead they find their worth through their oneness with God. Now you have individuals no longer competing with each other because no one has private ownership of property. Instead, everyone can get their property or get what they need by way of a central unifying element that provides it.
I know Marx has been heavily influenced by Darwin, who thought that the natural world responded and adapted to struggle. So Marx applied that to human society and said that people needed the same thing. So the Marxist ideal utopia is created via essentially, as we've seen it play out in the world, in the 19th, 20th, and here in the 21st century, it is by annihilating the opposite to evolve society. And this is kind of a perversion of Hegelian thought, but he used it to further this idea of struggle.
Yeah, I've always been of the opinion, and I use that word intentionally here because I'm no Socrates, and I haven't found any deep truths. But I'm of the opinion that you become good at what you practice. So if your way of achieving a utopia is through the practice of violence, you're only going to get good at becoming violent. The utopia that your ideal will never materialize, no pun intended. So I think one of the crucial differences between Socrates and Marx is that one is a physical manifestation that relinquishes personal responsibility and shifts blame onto environment. It ignores ethics, virtue, morality altogether as far as the individual is concerned and shifts that onto the environment. Whereas in Socrates, the focus is on the individual. The individual has an ethic, moral, virtuous responsibility, and it's not about the material at all or the environment. It's all about the individual's mind. And the two extremes, it seems. It's the big metaphysical question that sort of goes throughout all of philosophies, which is primary. Is it matter or mind?
Okay. So in Socrates' day, I mean, we have Athens. Maybe that's a realization of his, what he was after. We look at Athens, as the foundation of Western civilization. And we also have, Marx and Hegel. They were instrumental in the rise of the Soviet Union and, communist China, all that. So are these the manifestations of their beliefs in our world here? Do you think?
I that's a really interesting question. I I would think so, but so the postmodern movement, which focuses distinctly on ethics, they believe to be the ethics of Marxism. They often claim that Stalinism, for instance, or Leninism is not Marxism. It's an appropriation of that type of thought, and they've appropriated it in ways that have made Marxist thought not implemented well, even though it's been implemented like over 100 countries and has devastated all of them. But they make the same claim about someone like Socrates or Christianity, for instance, and they find things inherently wrong with those thinkers. So the rationality of Socrates, which was adopted by Christianity, is what caused things like inquisitions, holy wars, crusades, World War II. That type of rationality is the reason for that. But Nietzsche, the ideas within Nietzsche's philosophy and the ideas in Marxist philosophy are not the cause or are not responsible for fascist Germany or socialist Russia or China, communist China. And I just find that to be really hypocritical. It's really problematic. So I think just like you brought up earlier with scientific rationalism, that there are things that are potentially wrong with rationalism, especially when it's removed from a morality or an ethics. And maybe that is steeped in Plato's, if not Socrates' philosophy. And the same can be said for Nietzsche and Marx. That there are things inherently just problematic. And when you try to exercise those things in real life, you end up destroying lives.
So while Socrates focused on virtue, Marx's focus was solely on the material, about selfish aims and a struggle against the opposite. Do you think that is a cause of the societal dysfunction?
I think it's the other way around. I think Socrates would say, when you find out what's good for you as an individual, you'll be able to save your soul. The only thing that's really good is virtue, ethics, morality. I think that Marxism, at least how it manifests itself, is that I ask what's good for me and then force everyone else to conform to that. So I confuse my beliefs of what's good for myself with the belief that it's also good for everyone and therefore should be forcibly implemented.
Okay, where is in Socrates, he's arguing again that you have to become that ideal person that's striving toward goodness or virtue, right? That's what he's after is virtue.
Right, yes. By way of your own individual responsibility. No one else can do it for you. So I think that that's just one of the big major differences between the two. But I also think that, there's contradiction inherent in both of them. And I think both of them would also say that, where the contradiction will lead to a harmonious state. And again, we see something similar in Taoism, where there are contradictions, but the idea is harmony. The idea is harmony. The difference, though, between Marxism and these other things that consider opposing or contrasting elements is that Marxism employs violence as a practice to harmonize, which doesn't make sense.
Do you think most of us today have deeper truths or just opinions? Once again, I'm Jessica Beatty. Thanks for listening to America Daily. Until next time.
This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.